Will Crimea become the place where Putin's war starts to break in full view of the world? And what happens when the peninsula Russia called untouchable begins to feel like a trap instead of a trophy? If you want sharp videos that cut through noise, hit like, subscribe, and share this with one person who never misses a geopolitics story. For years, Crimea was sold to Russians as proof that history could be reversed by force. In 2014, the Kremlin grabbed the peninsula, wrapped it in flags, and told the country that Russia had returned to glory. That message mattered far beyond maps. Crimea was not just land. It was emotion. It was prestige. It was a promise that Moscow could act, take, and keep. And that is exactly why what is happening now feels so dangerous for the Kremlin. Because Ukraine does not need to charge straight into Crimea tomorrow to change the war. It only needs to make the peninsula harder and harder to hold. Harder to supply, harder to defend, harder to pretend is safe. That is the real story here. Not a movie scene where everything falls in one day, but a slower and more ruthless process. A process of isolation. When people hear a title like this, they imagine gates slamming shut and huge armies being instantly surrounded. That is not what sealed means in modern war. Sealed means roads become uncertain, bridges become targets, ports become risky, air bases become exposed, ammunition depots stop feeling hidden, command centers move farther away, families begin asking questions officials cannot answer, tourism dries up, insurance vanishes, confidence collapses before territory does. And Crimea is uniquely vulnerable to that kind of pressure. Look at a map, and the problem becomes obvious. Crimea is connected to mainland Ukraine by narrow approaches. It depends on a few major arteries for heavy military supply. One path runs through the land corridor Russia fought to hold across southern Ukraine. The other depends on the Kerch Bridge and maritime routes from Russia proper. For Moscow, Crimea looks like a fortress. For a strategist, it can also look like a pocket that survives only as long as its supply lines survive. This is why Ukraine has spent so much time and effort attacking not only soldiers but systems. Fuel storage, air defense batteries, radar nodes, headquarters, landing ships, ammunition sites, railway links. The idea is simple: make every Russian unit in Crimea fight with less certainty, less comfort, less protection, and less speed. A fortress can be strong from the front and still suffocate from the inside. That is where the fear begins for Moscow, because Crimea matters far beyond its beaches and ports. It has been one of Russia's main military platforms for projecting force into southern Ukraine and the Black Sea. Missiles have been launched from there, aircraft have operated from there, naval assets used its ports, logistics routes flowed through it. For Russia, Crimea has not been symbolic only. It has been operational. Remove its security, and you do not just hurt a headline. You damage a war machine. That is why every strike on the peninsula carries weight far beyond the explosion itself. A blast at an airfield is not just damage to concrete. It sends a message that nowhere is fully beyond reach. A successful attack on a naval target is not just a local tactical win. It tells every sailor, officer, and civilian that the sea is no longer a protective wall. A hit on an air defense site does not just remove hardware, it opens a psychological hole. And in war, psychological holes spread fast. For years, Russia treated Crimea as the jewel of its Black Sea position. It was supposed to project power, stability, and permanence, but Ukraine's long-range strikes and naval drone attacks changed the mood. Suddenly, ships had to move. Ports had to be reconsidered. Commanders had to think twice. The Black Sea Fleet, once marketed as a symbol of control, started looking exposed. Some vessels were relocated farther east, away from the center of danger. Even when Russia denied weakness, its behavior told a different story. Forces move when they no longer trust their own shield. This matters because military power is not only about how many assets you own, it is about where you can safely keep them, how quickly you can use them, and how confidently you can protect them. A fleet pushed back is not destroyed in total, but it is constrained. An aircraft that must fly from farther away loses flexibility. A command post that must keep moving loses rhythm. A supply line under constant threat loses efficiency. Piece by piece, the cost of holding Crimea rises, and rising cost is exactly what Ukraine wants. Ukraine understands something very important. It may not need a dramatic frontal assault if it can make Crimea militarily expensive, politically embarrassing, and socially unsettling. That is a different path to pressure. It turns the peninsula into a burden, and burdens are dangerous in authoritarian systems because they attack the image of control. Putin's power has always relied not just on force, but on the feeling that he can impose reality. Crimea was one of his biggest proof points. If that proof point starts cracking, the damage reaches Moscow's political core. That is why this story is so much bigger than one bridge or one missile strike. Think about what Crimea means inside Russia's narrative. State media did not present it as a temporary gain. It was framed as sacred, settled, emotional, and permanent. People were taught to see it as a historic correction. That means any serious instability there is not just a battlefield problem. It becomes a direct challenge to a myth the Kremlin built into national identity. Losing comfort in Crimea is one thing. Losing confidence in Crimea is far worse. And confidence is exactly what is under attack. Imagine being a Russian military family on the peninsula, or a civilian who moved there after annexation, believing Moscow's promises. At first, the war may have felt distant. Even after the invasion of 2022, many probably believed Crimea was still protected by layers of defense, by distance, by prestige. But then come the videos. Smoke rising near air bases, traffic jams near the bridge, naval targets hit at night, explosions in places that were never supposed to be vulnerable. Beach tourism disrupted. Air defenses firing over areas once marketed as peaceful. The message becomes impossible to ignore. This place is no longer insulated. That emotional shift matters because civilians change war math. Armies can absorb risk. Families are far less patient. Business owners ask whether it is worth staying. Local officials worry about panic. Occupation authorities tighten security, which creates more visible signs of fear. Every checkpoint, every road search, every emergency repair tells the population the same thing: the threat is real enough to disrupt normal life. And once normal life breaks, propaganda loses part of its spell. There is another reason Crimea feels more fragile than Moscow wants to admit. Geography gives power, but it also creates dependency. A peninsula is not easy to feed, fuel, and reinforce under pressure. Heavy military operations require a constant flow of ammunition, spare parts, air defense reloads, fuel, medical support, transport capacity, and communication stability. If even part of that system becomes unreliable, commanders must ration movement, disperse assets, or move critical systems farther back. None of those choices are free. That is why the Kerch Bridge remains so important, even beyond the symbolism attached to it. The bridge is not just concrete and steel. It is the visible backbone of Russia's claim that Crimea is physically tied to the Russian mainland forever. Every time it is damaged or threatened, the Kremlin faces two crises at once: a logistical crisis and an image crisis. Repairs can be made, but certainty is harder to rebuild than concrete. And even if the bridge stands, a bridge under threat does not function like a bridge in peace. Traffic must be managed. Security must be tightened. Movement becomes slower. The military competes with civilian needs. Inspection delays grow. Redundancy becomes necessary. Suddenly, one route turns into a source of constant anxiety. If this breakdown helps you see the map in a whole new way, tap the like button, subscribe for more deep dives, and share this video with a friend who loves strategy more than slogans. Now add the land corridor to the picture. After Russia seized territory in southern Ukraine, that corridor became critical because it created another route to sustain Crimea by land. That is one reason the fighting in the south has mattered so much. For Ukraine, every strike on logistics in occupied southern territory is also part of the Crimea problem. Rail nodes, depots, headquarters, and road networks in the south are not separate from Crimea's future. They are part of the same nervous system. This is why the battle over Crimea often looks indirect. Ukraine may strike in one area, but the effect is felt in another. A depot destroyed inland may weaken defenses on the coast. A radar knocked out in one district can open opportunities for follow-up attacks elsewhere. A command center hit far from the front can slow decisions across a wider sector. Russia then has to respond by redistributing systems, which creates fresh gaps. The whole thing becomes a moving stress test. And stress tests reveal truth. Russia can still hurt Ukraine badly. It still has missiles, aircraft, manpower, and the ability to adapt. That part should never be. But adaptation under pressure is not the same as control. Moscow has had to reinforce Crimea repeatedly. It has had to harden sites, move assets, improve camouflage, expand air defenses, and adjust basing decisions. Those are not signs of calm confidence. They are signs of a zone under active contest. And this is where the phrase 1 million Russians stranded starts to make emotional sense, even if the reality is more complex than a dramatic headline. Crimea's population is in the millions, and since annexation, Russia has encouraged migration, administration, tourism, military presence, and settlement. Add troops, workers, officials, families, and seasonal movement, and you get a huge human mass tied to the peninsula. They are not all literally trapped behind a closed gate. But if key links become unreliable, large numbers of people can begin to feel strategically stranded long before they are physically cut off. That feeling is enough to shake confidence. And confidence is the thing authoritarian governments fear most, losing all at once, because confidence holds together stories that facts alone cannot defend. There is also a legal and moral dimension to all of this. Ukraine sees Crimea not as a distant side issue, but as sovereign territory under occupation. That matters because it shapes its strategy. From Kyiv's point of view, pressure on Crimea is not some optional stunt. It is part of making continued occupation impossible. The goal is not only military attrition. It is to prove that Russia cannot turn seizure into normality. This is why strikes on Crimea carry symbolic force internationally too. Every successful attack challenges the idea that Russia's annexation created irreversible facts. It tells allies that support still matters. It tells occupied populations that reach is possible. And it tells Moscow that time does not automatically legitimize conquest. But let's go deeper, because the real stakes are even larger. Crimea is not just about Crimea. It sits at the heart of the Black Sea struggle. Control from the peninsula affects maritime routes, missile positioning, surveillance, air operations, and regional influence. When Russia felt secure there, it could project force outward with greater confidence. When Ukraine makes Crimea uncertain, that outward projection weakens. The impact is felt across the wider theater, from naval posture to export security to the perception of Russian reach. That wider effect helps explain why Ukraine has invested so much in asymmetric methods. It cannot match Russia ship for ship in a classic naval race, so it found cheaper ways to impose pain. Naval drones, long-range strikes, intelligence-led targeting, and layered pressure turned a stronger fleet into a more cautious fleet. That is one of the most important lessons of this war. A power that dominates on paper can still be pushed back if its vulnerabilities are found and exploited with persistence. And Crimea has become the clearest example of that lesson. The Kremlin now faces a brutal dilemma. To protect Crimea, it must pour in more resources. But the more resources it pours in, the more valuable the target set becomes for Ukraine. More air defenses mean more systems to hunt. More logistics traffic means more choke points to pressure. More headquarters activity means more signatures to detect. More occupation infrastructure means more things that must be guarded at all times. The act of defending the peninsula can increase the burden of defending it. That is how strongholds become traps. And if Russia loosens its grip instead, the political cost may be even worse. Because Crimea is not just another sector of the front where officials can quietly redraw expectations. It is sacred territory in the Kremlin's language. A tactical withdrawal somewhere else can be explained away. A visible decline in Crimea is much harder to spin. It would hit prestige, patriotism, and Putin's personal image all at once. So Moscow is stuck. Escalate the defense and admit by behavior that Crimea is vulnerable, or downplay the danger and risk greater humiliation when the next strike lands. Neither option is comfortable. This is where Ukraine's strategy becomes psychologically sharp. It does not need to announce a final countdown. It only needs to keep proving reach. Keep showing that expensive Russian systems can be found, keep forcing redeployments, keep making civilians uneasy, keep turning every summer season, every naval movement, every bridge crossing into a reminder that the war is present. Over time, that creates something more powerful than one spectacular attack. It creates erosion. And erosion is terrifying because it is hard to point to the exact day control began slipping. By now, you can probably see why Crimea has become one of the most sensitive pressure points in the entire war. So if this analysis is giving you real value, subscribe now, leave a comment with the word Crimea, and send this video to someone who still thinks geography alone wins wars. Now consider the soldiers stationed there. Every military position depends on routine. Supplies arrive, orders flow, defenses are layered, command posts coordinate, maintenance cycles stay predictable. But when a location enters a constant threat environment, routine becomes fragile. Troops sleep differently. Vehicles disperse. Ammunition is moved more carefully. Aircraft may be relocated or launched under tighter constraints. Radar operators stay under more stress. Leaders spend more time reacting. That does not always show up on a map, but it changes combat performance. Now, the same applies to the air war. Air defense in Crimea has been one of Russia's top priorities because the peninsula protects assets and symbolism at the same time. But no air defense system is magic. It depends on radar coverage, command coordination, interceptor stocks, discipline, and survivability. If Ukraine can repeatedly force Russia to turn systems on, move them, expose them, or replace them, then even the act of defending becomes exhausting. That is why periodic strikes matter so much. They do not only destroy, they wear down. And when air defenses are strained, every other asset becomes less comfortable. Aircraft, depots, ships in port, headquarters, fuel farms, communication hubs. Once the shield feels thinner, the whole ecosystem gets nervous. Then there is the sea. The Black Sea used to be one of the arenas where Russia expected intimidation to work almost automatically. But maritime drones and precision strikes have changed that story. A ship does not need to be sunk every week for naval posture to change. It only needs to stop feeling safe in places where it once felt dominant. That is what makes Ukraine's campaign so clever. It turned presence itself into a liability. Every port call, every patrol route, every moored vessel became a possible moment of exposure. That shift had consequences far beyond the military. It affected insurance, grain routes, international perception, and the story each side could tell about who really controls the Black Sea space. Power is partly about physics. It was also partly about confidence. Crimea's erosion attacks both. And then there is Putin himself. For Putin, Crimea has always been personal, in a way many territories are not. It was tied to his image as the leader who reversed humiliation and restored Russian strength. That is why problems there are not processed like routine battlefield setbacks. They cut into a founding myth of his later rule. If ordinary Russians start seeing Crimea as a vulnerable burden instead of a triumphant return, something deeper shifts. The state can censor language. It can punish dissent. It can shape television, but it struggles when daily reality keeps contradicting the story. A bridge closed again. Another beach warning. Another explosion near a military site. Another fleet asset moved. Another report of air defenses firing at night. People do not need a formal speech to understand what these signals mean. They begin connecting dots on their own. That is when fear becomes political. And remember, Ukraine does not need all Russians in Crimea to flee tomorrow for this strategy to matter. It only needs doubt to spread faster than certainty. Once doubt becomes normal, every future strike has a bigger effect than the last. Markets react faster. Tourism weakens faster. Parents worry faster. Occupation administrators overreact faster. Military planners hedge harder. The same blast produces more disruption because the emotional ground is already cracked. This is also why talk of Crimea often makes Moscow unusually sensitive. The peninsula is where military logic and regime psychology overlap. Lose ground elsewhere, and the regime can argue it was temporary, tactical, or due to NATO support. But admit that Crimea itself is vulnerable, and you touch a nerve that propaganda spent a decade trying to harden. So what happens next? The most realistic answer is not a single dramatic liberation scene tomorrow morning. It is a contest of reach, resilience, logistics, and narrative. Ukraine will keep trying to stretch Russian defenses, isolate key nodes, and make the peninsula costlier to hold. Russia will keep trying to reinforce, conceal, reroute, and punish. One side wants Crimea to feel impossible to normalize. The other wants it to feel permanently absorbed. That is the real battle. And the side that wins that battle may not be the side with the louder speech. It may be the side that better understands pressure, because pressure changes decisions before it changes flags. If you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel is built for. Like the video if you want more scripts like this, subscribe before the next flashpoint hits, and share it now so your group chat has at least one person bringing facts instead of noise. Here's the hardest truth for the Kremlin. Crimea was supposed to showcase Russian permanence. Instead, it is becoming a test of Russian endurance. That is a very different thing. Permanence says, this is settled. Endurance says, we are struggling to keep this. And once a government is pushed from the language of permanence into the language of endurance, it has already lost part of the political war. That does not mean Russia is about to collapse there overnight. Serious states can absorb damage. Armies can improvise. Supply can be rerouted. Bridges can be repaired. Propaganda can be intensified. Repression can silence open panic. All of that is true, but none of it comes free. Each fix costs resources. Each response reveals vulnerability. Each emergency measure teaches the other side where the pressure works. That is why the phrase Crimea is sealed should be understood not as a final snapshot, but as a direction of travel. The peninsula is being turned into a contested space where Russia must spend more and more effort just to defend what it once called secure. If that continues, the strategic meaning is enormous. Crimea stops being a launch pad and starts becoming an anchor tied to Moscow's ankle. And anchors are dangerous in war. They slow movement. They absorb attention. They force protection. They punish overconfidence. Now think again about the title. Putin's 1 million Russians stranded. The number may be dramatic, but the underlying point is real. When a regime pours civilians, soldiers, administrators, settlers, and infrastructure into a politically sacred peninsula, it creates hostages to its own narrative. The more people it binds to the promise of normal life there, the more painful instability becomes. A contested Crimea is not only a military problem, it is a human, psychological, and political exposure point. That is why every strike, every disruption, every sign of insecurity lands so hard. It is not just about damage. It is about what the damage says. It says the war can reach where Russia said it could not. It says the map Moscow tried to freeze is still moving. It says occupation is not the same thing as control. And maybe most important of all, it says time is not automatically on the side of the occupier. If Ukraine keeps tightening pressure, Crimea may become the place where the illusion of untouchable Russian power finally breaks in a way no speech can hide. Not because the peninsula falls in one instant, but because the story holding it up starts collapsing piece by piece. And when a story like that collapses, the shock travels far beyond the shoreline. Because then the question is no longer whether Russia took Crimea. The question becomes whether Russia can still hold the meaning of Crimea together. And if it cannot, then the peninsula that once made Putin look strongest could become the place that shows the world exactly where he is weakest. Script data: will Crimea become the place where Putin's war starts to break in full view of the world? And what happens when the peninsula Russia called untouchable begins to feel like a trap instead of a trophy? If you want sharp videos that cut through noise, hit like, subscribe, and share this with one person who never misses a geopolitics story. For years, Crimea was sold to Russians as proof that history could be reversed by force. In 2014, the Kremlin grabbed the peninsula, wrapped it in flags, and told the country that Russia had returned to glory. That message mattered far beyond maps. Crimea was not just land, it was emotion, it was prestige. It was a promise that Moscow could act, take, and keep, and that is exactly why what is happening now feels so dangerous for the Kremlin. Because Ukraine does not need to charge straight into Crimea tomorrow to change the war. It only needs to make the peninsula harder and harder to hold, harder to supply, harder to defend, harder to pretend is safe. That is the real story here. Not a movie scene where everything falls in one day, but a slower and more ruthless process, a process of isolation. When people hear a title like this, they imagine gates slamming shut and huge armies being instantly surrounded. That is not what sealed means in modern war. Sealed means roads become uncertain, bridges become targets, ports become risky, air bases become exposed, ammunition depots stop feeling hidden, command centers move farther away, families begin asking questions officials cannot answer, tourism dries up, insurance vanishes, confidence collapses before territory does. And Crimea is uniquely vulnerable to that kind of pressure. Look at a map, and the problem becomes obvious. Crimea is connected to mainland Ukraine by narrow approaches. It depends on a few major arteries for heavy military supply. One path runs through the land corridor Russia fought to hold across southern Ukraine. The other depends on the Kerch Bridge and maritime routes from Russia proper. For Moscow, Crimea looks like a fortress. For a strategist, it can also look like a pocket that survives only as long as its supply lines survive. This is why Ukraine has spent so much time and effort attacking not only soldiers, but systems, fuel storage, air defense batteries, radar nodes, headquarters, landing ships, ammunition sites, railway links. The idea is simple. Make every Russian unit in Crimea fight with less certainty, less comfort, less protection, and less speed. A fortress can be strong from the front and still suffocate from the inside. That is where the fear begins for Moscow, because Crimea matters far beyond its beaches and ports. It has been one of Russia's main military platforms for projecting force into southern Ukraine and the Black Sea. Missiles have been launched from there. Aircraft have operated from there. Naval assets used its ports. Logistics routes flowed through it. For Russia, Crimea has not been symbolic only. It has been operational. Remove its security, and you do not just hurt a headline. You damage a war machine. That is why every strike on the peninsula carries weight far beyond the explosion itself. A blast at an airfield is not just damage to concrete. It sends a message that nowhere is fully beyond reach. A successful attack on a naval target is not just a local tactical win. It tells every sailor, officer, and civilian that the sea is no longer a protective wall. A hit on an air defense site does not just remove hardware. It opens a psychological hole, and in war, psychological holes spread fast. For years, Russia treated Crimea as the jewel of its Black Sea position. Sevastopol was central to that image. It was supposed to project power, stability, and permanence.